side. Morden College stood nearby, a building of the 17th century, backing onto grounds that would later become significant in this case. The lane was called Kidbrooke Lane. On the morning of Wednesday, the 26th of April, 1871, a police constable walking that lane in the dark found a girl on her hands and knees. She was alive. She would not be alive for much longer. What followed her discovery, the inquiry, the trial, the acquittal, the riots, the pamphlet, the libel proceedings, and the monument that still stands, constitutes one of the most extensively documented and most deeply unresolved criminal cases of the Victorian period. This is the record of what happened, not what was alleged, not what was written afterwards, not what the crowd believed, or what the newspapers made of it, or what the pamphlet argued, what the record contains, and then, in the sections that follow, what the record became. We begin with the two people at the center of this case, Jane Maria Clouson. The name appears in the contemporary record with several variant spellings, Clouson, and in at least one instance, Clenson. The discrepancy is not incidental. It reflects the gap between press transcription and the civil registration record. And it matters because later reconstructions of her life have had to reconcile those different renderings against census and birth material. The most securely supported version of her name from the accessible record is Jane Maria Clouson. She was 17 years old. Her mother was dead by the time of the attack. The contemporary pamphlet and the memorial erected after her death both make that point explicitly. Her father, James Clouson, is identified in later genealogical material based on census and registration sources as a dock labourer. Her mother had worked as a dressmaker. The family was from Deptford, a working district on the south bank of the Thames, east of Greenwich. Jane had been in domestic service. The Times reported on the 2nd of May, 1871, that she had lived as a domestic servant in the family of the father of the accused for a period of a year and 10 months, and had left that situation a fortnight before the attack. A later summary of the press coverage gives the figure as approximately 2 years and gives the date of departure from the household as the 11th of April, 1871. She had gone to reside with friends in Greenwich. The household she had left was that of a stationer. The business was located in London Street, Greenwich. The father's name was Ebenezer Pook. The son's name was Edmund Walter Pook. He was 20 years old. The contemporary record describes him as a printer employed in his father's business. The pamphlet The Eltham Tragedy Reviewed, written by Newton Crosland and published in the weeks after the trial, describes him as employed in the family stationery trade and adds that he had been involved in musical entertainments. Those details come from a Tier 3 source and are noted as such. What is secure from the contemporary record is his age, his social position as the son of a respectable tradesman in Greenwich, and his connection to the family printing business. Those two facts, servant girl, employer's son, are the axis on which everything else in this case turns. What the relationship between them actually was remains, in the admissible record, a matter of allegation and denial. The prosecution theory, as reported in the contemporary press, was that Jane had become pregnant by Edmund Pook, and that the pregnancy was the motive for the attack. Two female informants drew police attention to Pook in the days after the attack. The first said that Jane had confided in her that she had had what the record calls improper intimacy with him. The second said that Jane had told her she was going to meet Pook on Blackheath, near a place referred to in the record as Prince Arthur's, on the night of the murder, and that the purpose of the meeting was to arrange what she called the preliminaries of marriage. Against that, Pook gave sworn evidence at Bow Street and at Greenwich Police Court. The record of what he said there is clear. He stated that he had never had any intimacy with Jane Maria Clouson, had never made an appointment to meet her, had never walked out with her, and had never corresponded with her. The Pook family's public position, as preserved in later summaries of the trial record, was that Jane had been dismissed from service not because of any affair, but because of repeated warnings about slovenly habits and unkempt appearance. The record therefore contains allegation on one side and categorical denial on the other. No Tier 1 source in the accessible record establishes the nature of the relationship as fact. What the post-mortem did establish, and this is a medical finding, not an allegation, was that Jane was approximately 2 months pregnant at the time of her death. The pamphlet states that the post-mortem found she was 2 months in the family way and adds that the fetus had been dead for at least a fortnight. A contemporary summary of the trial evidence gives the same finding, approximately 2 months pregnant. The pregnancy is medically confirmed. Paternity is not established in the admissible record. Those distinctions matter. The episode will observe them throughout. Now we come to what is actually documented, what the record contains with precision and without dispute. The night of Tuesday the 25th of April, 1871, Jane Clouson left her lodgings that evening. She was living with friends in Greenwich after leaving the Pook household a fortnight earlier. She went out and did not return. At 4:15 in the morning of Wednesday the 26th of April, 1871, Police Constable Gunn, collar number 295R, was on his beat in Kidbrooke Lane. He found a girl on the ground. Gunn's testimony before the magistrate is one of the most important primary extracts in this case. He said that when he found her, she was lying on her hands and knees and bobbing her head, with blood about her head and face. He asked who had injured her. She said faintly, "Oh, my poor head. Oh, my poor head." Then she raised her left hand and said, "Take hold of my hand." He took hold of her hand. She fell forward onto her face and said, "Let me die." He asked again what was the matter. She made no further reply. That sequence of words, "Oh, my poor head, take hold of my hand, let me die," is the version of her final utterance that comes from the first-hand testimony of the officer who found her. There is a second version. The pamphlet by Newton Crosland is leaner in its account. It says that when the constable took her by the hand, she said faintly, "Oh, let me die," and that those were the only intelligible words extracted from her. The pamphlet also states that at the hospital nothing she uttered was distinctly audible. There is a third version. A much later source, a cemetery history summary, states that she also managed to say the name Edmund Pook. That account is not supported by the primary testimony retrieved here. It sits directly against the pamphlet's explicit claim that only "Oh, let me die" was intelligible. The dossier is clear on this point, and the script will follow it. The record contains multiple versions of her final words. It does not contain one settled, verified final utterance. The alleged naming of Pook will become legally central later in this case. At this stage, what the record gives us is a girl on the ground of Kidbrooke Lane, in the dark, before 5 in the morning, with blood about her head and face, saying words that the first witness to hear them later reported in one way, and the first published account reported in another. We do not know exactly what she said. We know she was alive. We know she could not tell anyone what had happened to her in a way that could be used in court. Both of those facts are important. Gunn documented the immediate scene. Her gloves were near her. Her hat lay within about 2 feet of her body. Sergeant Frederick George Haynes, collar number 26R, arrived later and added further detail to the scene record. He said she was lying on her back, head towards Morden College. He found a pair of gloves approximately 2 feet from the body. Her hat was off and lying close by. He noted that the hat was not broken and not dirty. Haynes also found, at the scene or in her possession, her purse, a locket, 11 shillings and 4pence in coin, 2 keys and a pocket handkerchief. These items were consistently cited in the police court hearings and at trial, for what they showed was absent from the scene. Nothing had been taken. There was no evidence that robbery was the motive for the attack. Contemporary summaries also say there was no evidence of sexual assault. The physical record of the scene therefore establishes the following. Jane Clouson was found in Kidbrooke Lane in the early hours of the 26th of April. She was conscious but severely injured. Her personal belongings were at the scene. Nothing was missing. Her hat was undamaged by the ground. Footmarks in the area were noted. Haynes later said that blood spots were found on pebbles near the brook. He also described what he characterized as sliding footsteps in the vicinity. Those physical details, the undamaged hat, the untouched purse, the blood on the pebbles, the footmarks, form the foundation of the physical reconstruction that would later be attempted at trial. The transport chain is recoverable from the testimony. Gunn arranged for Jane to be taken first to Dr. King's surgery. From Dr. King's, she was transferred to Guy's Hospital. Haynes said he obtained a stretcher and had her conveyed, first to Dr. King's and afterwards to Guy's. The pamphlet says she was received at Guy's at approximately 7 o'clock in the morning on the 26th of April. She remained at Guy's Hospital for 4 days. Michael Harris, surgeon of Guy's Hospital, gave evidence before the magistrate and at trial. His testimony is the primary medical record for this case. He said that Jane arrived at 7 o'clock on Wednesday morning, suffering from wounds on the face, ears, arms and hands. There were, he said, altogether about a dozen incised wounds on the face, some more severe than others. 2 were on the side of the ear. 1 wound, on the right side above the eye, was described in the following terms. The bone was all smashed up and the brain was protruding. He said there was no injury to the back of the head. His opinion as to the cause of the injuries was that they had been inflicted by a sharp and heavy instrument, such as the implement produced in court. That implement was a hammer. The hammer evidence will be examined in detail in the section that follows. For now, it is sufficient to note the type of wound and the type of instrument that the prosecution's medical witness identified as consistent with those wounds. Harris also examined the clothing of the accused at a later stage of the proceedings. He said that marks on the hat and trousers greatly resembled blood, though analysis was still required at that point. What was recovered from Dr. Letherby, the chemical witness who appeared at the police court stage, was an opinion that there were numerous spots of blood on the left leg of the trousers, 1 on the right leg, and a human hair on the left leg that corresponded in color with Jane's hair. Victorian forensic science could not date bloodstains. That limitation was understood by contemporaries and would become significant at trial. Jane Clouson died at Guy's Hospital on Sunday the 30th of April, 1871. The time of death is given in contemporary sources as either about 9:15 or about 9:30 in the morning. The discrepancy between those 2 versions is minor. What matters is the date, Sunday the 30th of April, 4 days after she was found in the lane. She had not, in those 4 days, made any statement that could be used in the proceedings that followed. The pamphlet is explicit that nothing she uttered at the hospital was distinctly audible. She died still unidentified in the official record. The pamphlet says that at the hour of her death, she had not yet been formally identified. At approximately 11 o'clock that same night, a man and a woman came to Greenwich police station. They said they were looking for a missing niece. The following morning, the body was identified as Jane Maria Clouson. The identification was made by her aunt, Mrs. Elizabeth Trott. Trott gave evidence before the magistrate. She said she had identified Jane on Monday morning. The means of identification she described were the nose, the mouth, a mole on the right breast, and the dress. The wounds to the face had been severe enough that recognition of facial features required supplementary physical identifying marks. The name of the girl in the lane had taken more than 4 days to reach the record. Now we turn to the arrest. Contemporary reporting says that Inspector John Mulvaney of Scotland Yard arrested Edmund Walter Pook at 3 o'clock in the afternoon on Sunday the 30th of April, 1871, the same day Jane died and before she had been formally identified. The basis for that arrest is recoverable from the police court testimony. The pamphlet says that 2 female informants had told police that Jane had confided an improper intimacy with Pook and that she had said she was going to meet him on the night of the murder. On the basis of that information, police had visited Pook on the 1st of May in the pamphlet's account. Though the arrest date of the 30th of April in contemporary press summaries creates a slight discrepancy in the timeline that the accessible record does not fully resolve. What can be said with confidence is that police attention moved to Pook because those 2 informants had connected him to Jane's movements on the night of the attack. Superintendent James Griffin gave evidence at the police court. He repeated evidence he had previously given before the coroner. He recounted the substance of the initial conversation with Pook, in which Pook denied that Jane was anything to him. Griffin also recounted Pook's account of his movements on the Monday and Tuesday evenings preceding the attack. Pook said that on Monday night he had been nearly all of the time with his brother about town. On Tuesday night, the night of the attack, he said he had gone to see a young lady at Lewisham but had not seen her. He was asked whether he had met anyone who knew him and said no, then added that he had met a person referred to in the record as our boy. He gave an account of returning home, which included a claim that he had run part of the way because he felt a fit coming on. Griffin also conveyed Pook's account of the blood found on his clothing. Pook's explanation, as reported by Crosland, was that the blood on both sides of his hat had been spurted from his tongue, which he bit in a fit, and that he had soiled and then brushed one knee of his trousers after falling in South Street. The seizure or epilepsy claim ran through Pook's entire account of his movements on the relevant evenings. Griffin told the magistrate that Pook had said his family never left him more than 20 minutes because he was subject to fits. That claim was not supported at trial by any medical evidence. The pamphlet notes explicitly that no medical man was called to explain the liability to fits, and observes the inconsistency between the family's claimed close supervision and Pook's having been absent from home for approximately 2 hours on the Tuesday evening. The inquest preceded the police court hearings and the trial. The coroner's name and the exact sitting dates of the inquest are not recoverable from a directly accessible verbatim inquest transcript in the material that forms the basis of this dossier. That gap is stated directly. What is clear from multiple contemporary and near-contemporary summaries is that the case went to the coroner's court first, and that the coroner's jury returned a verdict of wilful murder against Edmund Walter Pook. The exact wording of that verdict, beyond those 2 words, remains unverified in the accessible record. Some inquest testimony survives in the record because witnesses at the subsequent Greenwich police court hearings stated that they were repeating evidence they had already given at the inquest. The clearest of those instances involves Miss Alice Wicks of Belmont Road, Lee. She testified at the police court stating that she was repeating the evidence she had given at the coroner's inquest. Her evidence covered a series of conversations with Pook on the Sundays immediately before and after the murder. On Sunday, the 23rd of April, the Sunday before the attack, she had asked Pook whether he had seen a Miss Durnford. He said no, but that he wanted to see her on Thursday. On the Sunday after the murder, he told Wicks that he had gone to try to see Miss Durnford on Thursday evening and again on Tuesday evening, but had not seen her. He also said in that same conversation that he had shaved off his moustache because he had some comic business to do. The moustache detail was noted at the time and would recur in later commentary. Its evidential significance lay in the possibility that it constituted concealment of a physical identifying feature. Miss Durnford herself also appears in the record. The pamphlet records that on the 19th of May, she swore that the whistle found near the scene at Kidbrooke Lane was like the one Pook used to summon her. The whistle was a separate item of circumstantial evidence. Police Sergeant George Willis, collar number 39R, had received it from the lane and taken it to Eltham Police Station. He noted that police generally carried rattles rather than whistles. The magistrate's hearings at Greenwich Police Court are more fully preserved in the accessible record than the inquest proceedings. The court was presided over by Magistrate Mr. Maud. Appearing for the Crown was Mr. Poland. Mr. J.L. Pulling appeared for the relatives of the deceased. Superintendent Griffin watched the case for the police authorities. The prisoner was defended by his father's solicitor. The hearings produced a substantial body of testimony that effectively bridged the gap between the inquest and the trial. Witnesses were examined and cross-examined across multiple sittings. Remands were granted. One anticipated witness, a Mrs. Sparshott, failed to attend through illness, and her evidence was carried forward as an outstanding matter. Her importance to the case lay in her husband's role in the hammer chain of evidence. That chain will be examined fully in the next section. At the conclusion of the committal proceedings, Magistrate Maud found that a case had been made out sufficient to send Pook for trial at the Central Criminal Court. Pook was asked if he wished to say anything. The record of what he said at that point is brief. He said, "I am not guilty." Before we close this first section, there is a piece of physical evidence that requires its own paragraph. The weapon. A hammer was found. The record describes it as a plasterer's hammer, or in some summaries a hammer hatchet. It was found in the grounds of Magdalen College, between Eltham and Greenwich, the college whose grounds backed onto the area where Jane was discovered. The hammer had blood and hair adhering in a notch. The investigation of that hammer became one of the most contested evidential threads in the entire case. Police inquiry initially went in the wrong direction. A report came in that such a hammer had been sold by an ironmonger named Thomas on the 22nd of April. It later emerged that the relevant hammer, described in the case as the real hammer, had been sold at the same shop on the 24th of April, 2 days before the attack. Joel Harris, described in the record as a traveller to the firm of Turner and Naylor of Sheffield, gave evidence at trial that he had supplied 6 lath hammers, bearing the trademark J. Sorby, to Thomas on the 8th of November. That evidence established the type and provenance of the stock from which the weapon was likely drawn. The attempt to identify who purchased the hammer on the 24th of April produced contradictory results that will be examined in full in Section 2. For the purposes of this opening section, the physical fact is established. A hammer with blood and hair in the notch was recovered from the grounds of Magdalen College. Michael Harris gave his opinion that the wounds were consistent with a sharp and heavy instrument of that type. The instrument existed. The trail from the instrument back to a purchaser was the problem the prosecution could not fully close. There is one further point to establish before this section ends. Jane Clouson was found in Kidbrooke Lane on the 26th of April, 1871. She died at Guy's Hospital on the 30th of April, 1871. She was 17 years old. She was a domestic servant from Deptford. She was motherless. She had been in service with the Pook family for approximately 2 years and had left that household 2 weeks before she was attacked. She was approximately 2 months pregnant at the time of her death. None of those facts are in dispute. They come from medical testimony, from civil registration material, from the evidence of her aunt, and from the contemporary press record. They are the fixed points on which everything else in this case rests. What is in dispute is almost everything that connects those fixed points to any named individual. The prosecution theory, the circumstantial evidence, the alleged dying identification, the hammer purchase, the bloodstains, the alibi, the epilepsy claim, all of those things were contested at the time, resolved differently at different stages of the proceedings, and have remained unresolved in the historical record since. Edmund Walter Pook was tried for the wilful murder of Jane Maria Clouson. He was acquitted. The jury deliberated for approximately 20 minutes. When the verdict was announced outside the Central Criminal Court, the crowd waiting in the street reacted with what contemporary sources describe as anger and disappointment. Within days, Greenwich saw what those same sources call riotous demonstrations. Pook's house was mobbed. The police had difficulty dispersing the crowd. Some reports connected the anger directly to a belief that he had escaped conviction because of his social standing and his family's connections. A monument was erected in Brockley Cemetery by public subscription. Its inscription, as transcribed on Wikimedia Commons and discussed by the Victorian Web, describes Jane as a motherless girl who was murdered in Kidbrooke Lane. It records her last words as, "Oh, let me die." It was put up by the community in which she had lived and worked, after a jury had returned a verdict that the same community refused to accept as final. The inscription calls it murder. The verdict said otherwise. That gap between what the memorial says and what the court decided is what this episode is about. The Central Criminal Court, July 1871. The building that stood at the Old Bailey in the summer of 1871 was not the building that stands there now. The present structure dates from 1907. What Pook entered in July of that year was the older Sessions House, a building that had processed London's most serious criminal cases for the better part of a century. It was a place with the weight of accumulated procedure about it. Juries, judges, counsel, witnesses, defendants. The machinery of English criminal law, the trial of Edmund Walter Pook for the wilful murder of Jane Maria Clouson, began on the 12th of July, 1871. It continued across 4 days and ended with the verdict on the 15th of July. There is a date discrepancy in the secondary reporting. One summary states the case was arranged for the Central Criminal Court on the 10th of July. Contemporary press summaries give the start of the trial itself as the 12th. That discrepancy is an administrative one and does not affect the substance of what happened in court. The trial ran from the 12th to the 15th of July, 4 days. The presiding judge was Sir William Beauville, Lord Chief Justice of the Common Pleas. The prosecution was led by the Solicitor General, John Duke Coleridge. He was assisted by Mr. Poland, Mr. Archibald, and a further junior counsel whose name appears in the retrieved summaries with variant spellings, Beasley or Besley. The prosecution was the Crown. Its opening was delivered by one of the senior law officers of England. The defence was led by John Walter Huddleston, Queen's Counsel. He was assisted by Mr. Harrington and Mr. Besley in the summaries, again with some spelling variation across sources. These were not minor appointments, the Solicitor General opening a murder prosecution, a leading Queen's Counsel conducting the defence. The trial had the character of a significant public event before it began. Coleridge opened for the Crown. The prosecution opening, as recapped in the contemporary press, established the social coordinates of the case in its first minutes. Pook was described as the son of a stationer from London Street, Greenwich. Jane Clouson was described as the daughter of a night watchman from Deptford. Those two descriptions, placed in sequence at the opening of the trial, told the jury exactly what class of case they were being asked to decide. A young man from a respectable tradesman's family in Greenwich, a servant girl from a working family in Deptford. The prosecution case, as Coleridge presented it, rested on circumstantial evidence. There was no eyewitness to the attack. There was no surviving direct testimony from the victim about what had happened. The case was built from inference, from physical evidence, from chains of testimony, and from the accumulation of detail that pointed, in the prosecution's submission, to one conclusion. The core of the case was this: that Pook had arranged to meet Jane in Kidbrooke Lane on the night of the 25th of April, that he had killed her there, that the weapon used had been purchased by him 2 days earlier, and that the blood and hair found on his clothing were the physical trace of what he had done. The prosecution condensed its case into 9 points in the pamphlet record. The accessible sources do not reproduce all 9 in verbatim form, but the summary version of the prosecution case identifies the following elements: the relationship between Jane and Pook, the pregnancy and its likely paternity as a motive, the purchase of the hammer, the blood and hair on the clothing, the whistle, the sighting of a man matching Pook's description near the lane at the relevant time, a witness who swore to seeing Pook with a girl near the scene, Pook's account of his movements on the Tuesday evening, which he could not independently corroborate, and his conduct in the days following the murder, including the removal of the moustache. We examine each strand of the trial evidence in turn. The first witness from the scene was Police Constable Gunn, collar number 295R. Gunn told the court what he had told the magistrate. He described finding Jane at 4:15 in the morning. He described her posture, on her hands and knees, bobbing her head, blood about her head and face. He described the sequence of words he heard her say. He described the gloves near her body, the hat within 2 feet, undamaged and not dirty. He described the immediate removal to Dr. King's surgery. Gunn's evidence at trial was consistent with his earlier testimony. The defense did not successfully challenge the physical description of what he found. The scene as he described it was the scene that the entire case was built upon. Sergeant Frederick George Haynes, collar number 26R, followed. Haynes extended the scene description. He confirmed Jane's position, lying on her back with her head towards Magdalen College. He confirmed the hat, the gloves, and the personal belongings, the purse, the locket, 11 shillings and 4pence, 2 keys, and a pocket handkerchief. He described the blood spots on the pebbles near the brook. He described the sliding footsteps. The absence of robbery and the absence of sexual assault were established through Haynes's inventory of the scene. Everything Jane had been carrying when she went out that night was still on or near her body. Nothing had been taken. The physical story told by Gunn and Haynes together was of a targeted violent assault, not a robbery, not a random encounter. The person who attacked her had left her for dead in the lane without taking anything from her. That physical picture was consistent with a premeditated attack by someone who had come to the lane with a purpose other than theft. That inference belongs to the prosecution's reading. The physical facts themselves, no robbery, no sexual assault, belongings intact, are in the record. Elizabeth Trott, Jane's aunt, gave her identification evidence. She told the court she had identified Jane on the Monday morning following her death. She had done so by the nose, the mouth, a mole on the right breast, and the dress. The wounds to Jane's face had been severe enough that those supplementary physical features were required for identification. That is a detail the record preserves with precision, and it belongs here. Michael Harris, surgeon of Guy's Hospital, gave the central medical evidence. He described the wounds as he had first described them at the police court. Approximately a dozen incised wounds on the face, 2 wounds on the side of the ear, the wound above the right eye where the bone was smashed and the brain protruding. No injury to the back of the head. A sharp and heavy instrument, such as the implement produced in court. At the trial stage, Harris had completed the examination of Pook's clothing that had been pending at the earlier hearings. His evidence about the marks on the hat and trousers was that they greatly resembled blood. The chemical analysis, reported separately by Dr. Letherby, found numerous spots of blood on the left leg of the trousers, one on the right, and a human hair on the left leg, corresponding in color with Jane's hair. The wound evidence told the court what had been done to Jane Clouson's head with a sharp and heavy instrument. The clothing evidence told the court what had been found on the person of the accused. The connection between those 2 bodies of evidence was what the prosecution asked the jury to draw. Harris was cross-examined. The defense challenged the clothing evidence in particular. Victorian forensic science could not determine the age of a bloodstain. The defense exploited that limitation. The blood could have come from any cause at any time within a range that science in 1871 could not narrow. Pook had his explanation ready. The blood from the tongue, the fall in South Street, the brushed knee. Harris could not rule those explanations out on scientific grounds. He could only say what he observed. The spots greatly resembled blood. That remained his position under cross-examination. The hammer evidence occupied a substantial portion of the trial. Joel Harris, traveller to Turner and Naylor of Sheffield, established the supply chain. 6 lath hammers, trademark J. Sawley, supplied to Thomas on the 8th of November. That established the type and origin of the stock at the Thomas Ironmongery. Samuel Thomas gave evidence about the shop and his stock of hammers. The entry for the relevant sale on the 24th of April was part of the documentary record. The shop had sold a hammer of that type on that date. David Thomas, age 10, son of Samuel Thomas, was called. He had been present on the relevant evening. He said he had not seen his mother sell anything. A child witness recalling the absence of a transaction he had not observed. The evidential weight of that testimony was limited. Miss Cavell gave the most significant identification evidence in the hammer chain, and it was evidence of failure. She had been in the Thomas shop on the night of the 24th of April. She saw a young man come in approximately a quarter of an hour before she left. She described him: dark coat, light trousers, a low-crowned round hat. She saw Mrs. Thomas sell him something from the left-hand window. Later, she was taken to a police identification procedure and shown men, including the accused. She could not identify the purchaser from anyone shown to her. The defense used that failure. If the prosecution was maintaining that Pook had purchased the hammer at Thomas's shop on the 24th of April, and if a witness who had been present in the shop and observed the transaction could not identify Pook as the man, then the chain was broken at its most critical link. The prosecution's response was the Sparshot evidence. Sparshot, the neighbouring ironmonger, said a young man had come to his shop before going to Thomas's. He said he had no hammer of that type in stock and directed the young man to Thomas's. He said the young man told him the hammer was needed for a theatrical performance, and he said he identified that young man as Edmund Walter Pook. If Sparshot was right, Miss Cavell's failure to identify the purchaser at Thomas's was a problem for the prosecution, but not a fatal one, because Sparshot had already identified Pook as the man who had sought the hammer. The chain could be reconstructed: Sparshot's shop first, directed to Thomas's, purchased there, weapon later found at the scene. The complication was the Crawford evidence. After approximately 10 weeks, a man named Crawford came forward with a conversation involving Sparshot that the pamphlet treats as raising questions about Sparshot's identification. The verbatim substance of that conversation is not recoverable from the accessible sources. The pamphlet's characterization is that it cast doubt. Whether the jury treated it as doing so is not recorded separately from the verdict itself. The accessible record also does not contain a clear statement from Mrs. Thomas identifying Pook as the purchaser. The inference from the available sources is that her identification, if given at all, was not as firm as Sparshot's. The hammer evidence, in summary, was the prosecution's strongest physical strand after the clothing. It was also the strand most damaged by identification failure. The weapon existed. Its type and source were established. Its purchase on the 24th of April was documented. Who purchased it could not be conclusively proved. Alice Wicks gave the behavioural evidence. She connected Pook to the pattern of attempted appointments with Miss Durnford. She connected him to the removal of the moustache. She gave the court the texture of Pook's stated movements in the days surrounding the murder. The Sunday before the attack, Pook said he wanted to see Miss Durnford on Thursday. The Thursday in question was the day after Jane was found dying. He did not see Miss Durnford on Thursday. The Sunday after the murder, Pook said he had tried to see Miss Durnford on both Thursday and Tuesday, but had not seen her. He explained the moustache, some comic business. The prosecution's reading was that Tuesday night's movements, the failed visit to Lewisham, the return through the park, the onset of a fit, were a fabricated account of an evening spent in Kidbrooke Lane. The moustache removal was a change of appearance following the crime. The repetition of the Miss Durnford story was an attempt to establish a consistent narrative. The defence's reading was that Pook had been doing exactly what he said, attempting to visit a young woman, failing to see her, and explaining the moustache honestly. Wicks's evidence could support either reading. Its value to the prosecution was in the pattern it established. A man aware of his movements on the relevant evening, constructing an account of those movements in conversation with a witness, before that account would be formally required of him. Superintendent James Griffin gave the police evidence. He repeated what he had given at the inquest and the police court. The conversations with Pook, the denials, the account of Monday and Tuesday, the fit's explanation. He also gave the court the substance of Pook's initial characterization of Jane as nothing to him. That phrase, nothing to him, acquired force in the context of what the prosecution alleged. A young woman who had worked in his father's house for nearly 2 years, who was pregnant, who had been dismissed a fortnight before she was killed, was described by the son of that household as nothing to him. Griffin's role was to convey the substance of those early police conversations. He did so. The defense cross-examined on the reliability of those recollections and on the conduct of the investigation. Inspector John Mulvaney was also called. He had pressed Pook on his whereabouts and had formally arrested him on the afternoon of the 30th of April. His evidence reinforced the police court testimony already in the record. Miss Durnford gave the whistle evidence. She swore that the whistle found in Kidbrooke Lane was like the one Pook used to summon her. That identification was challenged. A whistle is not a uniquely identifiable object. The defense could argue that many such whistles existed and that the presence of this one near the scene proved nothing about who had carried it there. The prosecution's position was that its presence in the lane, combined with Miss Durnford's identification, was a further circumstantial thread in the fabric of the case. The defense's position was that it was too fragile a thread to carry weight. The locket was addressed through Humphreys and through the jeweller Randall. The prosecution had treated the locket found on Jane at the scene as a potential link to Pook. At the inquest, it had apparently come out that Jane had said the locket was given to her by him. Humphreys then came forward to claim he had given Jane the locket, not Pook. The jeweller Randall was associated with a curious remark, recalled in connection with the purchase. The accessible record does not reproduce Randall's exact evidence verbatim. The result was that the locket moved from being a potential link to being an unstable piece of evidence. Two competing claims of origin. A hearsay statement from Jane herself about where it came from, a statement that faced the same admissibility problems as everything else she had said. The locket did not resolve cleanly in either direction. We come now to the alibi. Pook's account of his movements on the Tuesday evening was the account he had given to Griffin from the beginning. He had gone to Lewisham to see Miss Durnford. He had not seen her. He had returned through the park. He had run part of the way home because he felt a fit coming on. He said his family never left him for more than 20 minutes because of his liability to fits. At trial, the epilepsy or seizure defense remained entirely unsubstantiated by medical evidence. No medical witness was called to confirm that Pook suffered from fits. No family member gave medical testimony. The pamphlet's observation is pointed. No medical man was called to explain the liability to fits. The defense offered the claim without the evidence. The alibi also had a corroboration problem. Pook had been in Lewisham and met no one who knew him, with the exception of a person referred to as our boy, an identification too vague and too unverified to provide useful independent confirmation. Alice Wicks confirmed that Pook had told her about the failed attempts to see Miss Durnford, but that was Pook's own account repeated to a witness, not an independent confirmation of where he had been. The pamphlet's criticism of the alibi is that the defense evidence was both too complete and partly inconsistent. The family's claim that Pook was so subject to fits that he was closely supervised was difficult to reconcile with his having been absent from home for approximately 2 hours on the Tuesday evening. If the supervision was as close as described, how had he been away for 2 hours without anyone in the family being able to account for his precise movements? The inconsistency was internal to the defense's own case. The pamphlet identified it. Whether the jury weighted it is unrecorded. There is one element of the prosecution case that requires specific attention, because the accessible record summarizes it as an aggregate rather than a named list. The prosecution claimed that multiple witnesses, later summaries give the figure as 7, had seen Pook and Jane together in the vicinity of the lane on the evening of the murder. The pamphlet's condensed version of the prosecution case says a witness swore to seeing Pook with a girl near the place where Jane Clouson was murdered. Contemporary press summaries say a man of Pook's description was seen hurrying along a lane at the right time and was seen returning to Greenwich in a state described as hot and excited. The dossier is explicit on this point. The accessible primary extracts do not reproduce all 7 witnesses in a single named list. 7 is a figure that appears in later summaries of the case. For the purposes of this script, it is reported as the prosecution's claimed aggregate. It is not presented as a recoverable named witness list from the primary record. What the press summaries do establish is that the prosecution had citing evidence. A man matching Pook's description near the lane at the relevant time, and the same man or a man of the same description returning to Greenwich in a condition consistent with recent physical exertion. Whether any of those witnesses were securely identified as having seen Pook specifically, or whether each identification faced the same problems as the others, is not fully resolvable from the accessible sources. Now we come to the ruling. It is the most legally significant single event in this trial. It occurred before the jury retired. It determined what the jury was permitted to hear, and it concerned the words that Jane Clouson had said, or may have said, in the hours after she was found in the lane. Contemporary summaries agree on what Lord Chief Justice Beauville decided. He ruled that all statements apparently made by Jane before her death, including the alleged naming of Edmund Pook, were inadmissible hearsay. They could not be placed before the jury. To understand why that ruling was understood at the time as decisive, it is necessary to understand what those statements were alleged to contain. The specific allegation that Jane had named Edmund Pook in the lane, or at the hospital, or in the period between her discovery and her death, was the most explosive piece of potential evidence in the entire case. If a dying woman had named her attacker, and if the law had permitted the jury to hear that, the circumstantial case against Pook would have been anchored to a direct identification. Beauville said the law did not permit the jury to hear it. The rule he applied was the hearsay rule. Under English law as it stood in 1871, a statement made by a person who was not present in court to give evidence and be cross-examined was inadmissible as proof of the truth of what it contained. Jane was dead. She could not be called. She could not be cross-examined. Therefore, what she had allegedly said, to Gunn in the lane or to anyone at the hospital, could not be admitted as evidence of what had happened to her or who had done it. The pamphlet attacked that ruling with force. Newton Crosland wrote that once the case ended in a verdict of acquittal, English law treated a declaration made behind a prisoner's back about the act charged as inadmissible. He then argued that excluding hearsay could leave, in his phrase, great gaps in a train of facts and could allow criminals to escape on a legal technicality rather than on the merits of the evidence. He then raised what is recognizable as a res gesti argument, an argument that has since developed in English law, asking whether the act charged was not the decoying away of the girl from her home to murder her, so that what she said in going to meet Pook ought to have been admitted as part of the same continuous transaction. That argument did not succeed in 1871. The ruling stood. The jury did not hear the alleged dying identification. What the jury heard, instead, was everything else: the hammer chain with its identification failure, the blood that could not be dated, the hair that could only be color-matched, the alibi that rested on an unsubstantiated medical claim, the moustache, the whistle, the pattern of movements, and the word of Sparshot against the silence of Mrs. Thomas and the uncertainty of Miss Cavell. The jury retired on the 15th of July, 1871. They deliberated for approximately 20 minutes. They returned a verdict of not guilty, 20 minutes, for a 4-day murder trial concerning the death of a 17-year-old girl. Contemporary and later summaries agree on that duration without comment as to its meaning. It is a fact in the record. What the jury said to one another during those 20 minutes is not recorded. Whether they found the circumstantial case too weak on its own terms, or whether they were influenced by the hearsay ruling's removal of the alleged identification, or whether other factors determined the speed of their decision, cannot be established from the record. What the record establishes is the duration and the outcome. Not guilty. Edmund Walter Pook walked out of the Central Criminal Court. He did not walk out quietly. The courtroom had been packed across the 4 days of the trial. A large crowd had gathered outside. When the verdict was announced within the court, contemporary sources say the public reaction inside was immediate. When the news reached those waiting outside, the mood turned to what sources describe as anger and disappointment. The word outside the court on the 15th of July, 1871, was not relief that an innocent man had been acquitted. It was fury that a guilty man had escaped. That public reading of the verdict is not the same as legal fact. The jury's decision was the law's decision, but the public response was its own kind of record. Within days, Greenwich saw what contemporary sources describe as riotous demonstrations. Pook's house was mobbed. Police reportedly had difficulty dispersing the crowd. Some reports explicitly connected the anger to a belief that Pook had escaped conviction because of his social position and his family's connections. The son of a very respectable tradesman in Greenwich, tried for the murder of a servant girl from Deptford. Not guilty after 20 minutes. The crowd outside the Old Bailey on the 15th of July drew its own conclusion. There is one further element that belongs in this section before we close it. The acquittal was not the end of the legal proceedings. It was, in one sense, only the beginning of a second set. Within weeks of the verdict, a pamphlet appeared on sale, The Eltham Tragedy Reviewed, written by Newton Crosland, published by F. Farrar. The pamphlet commented on the trial, reflected on the conduct of Lord Chief Justice Beauville, and condensed the evidence that the prosecution had assembled in its strongest form. It was read as an argument that the verdict was wrong and that the man who had been acquitted was guilty. On the 19th of August, 1871, an application was made at Bow Street for a summons against the publisher Farrar for publishing a libel upon Edmund Pook. The proceedings that followed, the criminal libel case, the civil libel actions, Pook against Crosland, Pook against Hartnoll, the proprietress of the Kentish Mercury, constitute a second chapter in the legal history of this case. They will be examined in Section 3. What matters here, in the context of the trial record, is what the libel proceedings represented. They were Edmund Pook's attempt, through the law, to close a case that his acquittal had not closed. They were his effort to use the courts to establish, as a matter of civil and criminal record, that Newton Crosland had libelled him by publishing material that treated an acquitted man as a murderer. The law had said, not guilty. The pamphlet had said, read the evidence. The crowd had said, we know what he did. The libel proceedings were the collision between those three positions in a courtroom. What the trial record ultimately contains, stripped of everything that was alleged and everything that was later written, is this: a 4-day hearing before one of England's most senior judges, a prosecution led by the Solicitor General, a defence led by a Queen's Counsel, witnesses to the scene, to the wounds, to the weapon, to the clothing, to the alibi, to the behaviour of the accused in the days surrounding the murder, a judge's ruling that excluded the most explosive piece of potential evidence in the case, a jury that deliberated for 20 minutes, and a verdict that the public outside the court refused to accept. The question the trial left open, the question every piece of evidence either answered partially or failed to answer at all, was whether Edmund Walter Pook had taken Jane Clouson to Kidbrooke Lane on the night of the 25th of April, 1871, and killed her there. The record does not answer that question. It never did. The verdict was returned on the 15th of July, 1871. By the end of that month, the case had a second life. Not in a courtroom, not in a coroner's hearing or a magistrate's room, or at the bar of the Central Criminal Court. In print, in the street, in the press, and eventually in a cemetery in southeast London, where a monument was erected by public subscription to a girl the law had declined to call a murder victim. This section examines what happened to the Jane Clouson case after Edmund Walter Pook was acquitted. It examines the pamphlet, the libel proceedings, the press campaign, the public demonstrations, the memorial, and the two false confessions that arrived years later to show that the case had not closed in the minds of the people who had followed it, even when it had formally closed in law. The reaction to the Pook acquittal is not peripheral to this case. It is the case. Because what the reaction reveals, in its specific targets, its specific language, its specific legal maneuvers, is a set of arguments about how English criminal law handled evidence, how courts handled class, and how the public handled a verdict it had already decided was wrong before the jury came back. We begin with the pamphlet. Newton Crosland was a writer. He was not a lawyer, not a journalist in any formal institutional sense, and not a figure of particular political prominence. He was a man who had followed the Pook trial, had read the evidence, had formed a view, and had written it down and published it. The pamphlet was called The Eltham Tragedy Reviewed. It was published by F. Farrar. It appeared within weeks of the verdict. What did the pamphlet say? The accessible record gives its character through contemporary press summaries and through Crosland's own later statements about the legal proceedings it generated. The pamphlet commented on the trial at the Central Criminal Court. It reflected on the conduct of Lord Chief Justice Beauville, specifically on his handling of the hearsay ruling and on his direction to the jury. It condensed the evidence that the prosecution had assembled, presenting its strongest version, and it invited its readers to draw their own conclusion about whether an innocent man had been acquitted or a guilty one had escaped. The pamphlet also made two specific reform proposals. It argued for the appointment of a public prosecutor, a proposal that reflected a broader Victorian debate about whether leaving prosecution to private initiative and police discretion produced consistent justice, and it argued for the introduction of a third verdict, not proven. That proposal pointed directly at the Pook case. Crosland's argument was that the jury had faced a binary choice, guilty or not guilty, when the evidence supported neither clear acquittal nor secure conviction. A not proven verdict would have expressed what contemporary commentary itself acknowledged, that the jury had found the case insufficiently proved, not that they had found Pook innocent. The not proven argument was not merely theoretical. A contemporaneous press article, Two Sensational Trials, had already made the same point editorially. That article argued that the jury could hardly have done otherwise than acquit on the evidence before it, but went on to say that had English law possessed a verdict of not proven, the jury would probably have returned it. That was the cleanest contemporary expression of the idea that acquittal did not mean exoneration. Crosland's pamphlet put that idea in a longer form and attached it to specific criticism of specific legal decisions made by a named judge. On the 19th of August, 1871, 5 weeks after the verdict, an application was made at Bow Street Police Court for a summons against Farrar, the publisher, for publishing a libel upon Edmund Walter Pook. The proceedings that followed divided in two directions. The first direction was criminal. The grand jury at the Central Criminal Court considered the bill against Farrar and ignored it. That result, an ignored bill, meaning the grand jury declined to find a case to answer, produced, according to the contemporary record, some applause in court. The publisher was not put on trial. Crosland, the author, was treated differently. He appeared at Bow Street on a summons, charging him as the author of the pamphlet. Evidence was given by Farrar himself and by a man named Frederick Lacey, described in the record as Pook's articled clerk, who had purchased copies of the pamphlet. The magistrate, Mr. Flowers, held that it was a case for the jury and committed Crosland for trial. The second direction was civil. By early February 1872, approximately 7 months after the verdict, civil litigation arising from the pamphlet was underway. The action brought by Pook against Crosland for libel had commenced and been adjourned. In the same period, the Lord Chief Baron and a special jury heard the case of Pook against Hartnell, brought against the proprietress of the Kentish Mercury for publication of the same libel. That case, Pook against Hartnell, ended by agreement. The verdict was for the plaintiff, Edmund Pook. The damages awarded were 40 shillings. There was the usual certificate as to costs, and there was an undertaking by both Hartnell and Crosland that no more copies of the letters and pamphlet complained of would be sold. 40 shillings. That was the assessed financial value of the reputational harm done to Edmund Walter Pook by the publication of material that treated him as the murderer of Jane Clouson. The result in Pook against Hartnell is worth pausing on. 40 shillings was a nominal sum. A jury had found in the plaintiff's favour, meaning they accepted that the publication was a libel, but they had assessed the damage to his reputation at 40 shillings. The legal verdict and the moral verdict were not quite aligned. A jury of special jurors in a civil court had found that the publication was technically a libel, but had not seen fit to award damages that suggested they regarded Edmund Pook as a man of unblemished character, whose reputation had been devastated by an unjust accusation. The accessible record does not reproduce the jury's reasoning. It records the sum. The civil proceedings in Pook against Crosland are less fully recoverable. A later cemetery history article asserts that in the civil cross-examination, Pook was required to answer questions that had not been permitted in the murder trial, and that he recovered £50 in damages. The accessible record for this episode does not verify those figures or those admissions against a contemporary law report. The dossier is clear on that limitation, and the script will follow it. What can be said with security is this: the civil proceedings existed, they continued into 1872, they reopened the evidential argument about the case in a public forum, and they were understood by contemporaries as a test of how far a writer could go in criticizing a completed criminal trial without unlawfully accusing an acquitted man. Crosland's own later characterization of the outcome in a preface to the pamphlet was that the prosecutions of the author, publisher, and vendor had resulted in failure. That is his word for it. It is not a neutral summary, and it is not a substitute for the missing verbatim court record. But it tells us how Crosland himself understood the proceedings he had been subjected to, as an attempt to silence him that had not fully succeeded. The pamphlet continued to exist. The undertaking in Pook against Hartnell prevented further sales of those specific copies. The argument the pamphlet had made, that the hearsay ruling was wrong, that the verdict left a gap where justice should have been, that English law needed a public prosecutor and a third verdict. Those arguments were not suppressed by the litigation. They had already been published, they had already been read. The press coverage of the case and its aftermath was extensive and is worth examining as a body of evidence in its own right. The Times had been covering the case since the 2nd of May, 1871. Its coverage continued through the trial dates of the 13th, 14th, 17th, 18th, and 21st of July. The Illustrated London News carried coverage on the 22nd of July. The Illustrated Police News had run a portrait of Pook on the 27th of May, before the trial began. The Cardiff Times and Welsh papers, digitised through the National Library of Wales, reprinted London proceedings. Regional and colonial newspapers across the English-speaking world carried the story. The class framing of the coverage was consistent and overt from the beginning. The Times, on the 2nd of May, described Pook as the son of a very respectable tradesman in Greenwich. Jane was identified as the family's former domestic servant. When Coleridge opened the prosecution at the Old Bailey, he described Pook as the son of a stationer from London Street, Greenwich, and Jane as the daughter of a night watchman from Deptford. That pairing, stationer's son, night watchman's daughter, was reproduced across the coverage and across the country. The language used to describe Jane in sympathetic and memorial writing followed a specific pattern. She was described as a motherless girl, as agreeable in manner, as amiable and affectionate in disposition, as a nice, clean, well-conducted girl. Those phrases come from Tier 2 and Tier 3 sources. They are characterizations, not facts. But they are part of the record of what was said about her, and they tell us something about how her public image was being constructed by those who wished to claim the case on her behalf. The construction worked in the opposite direction for Pook. The pamphlet described him as having been mixed up with musical entertainments and as having a lively taste for female beauty. That language came from a source hostile to him and was designed to suggest a character disposed to the conduct alleged. It was not neutral description. The press coverage of Pook was more varied. Some reporting simply described him as a young man of respectable family, while other coverage treated the allegation against him as effectively established by the weight of the circumstantial evidence. The split in the coverage reflected the split in public opinion. There was no unified press verdict on Pook. There was a dominant strand of coverage that treated the acquittal as legally correct, but morally unsatisfying, and a secondary strand that treated it as an outrage produced by judicial error and class protection. Both strands were present simultaneously in July and August of 1871. The public response outside the courtroom was not ambiguous. Contemporary sources described the crowd outside the Central Criminal Court reacting to the verdict with anger and disappointment. That is the language of the court reporters. The crowd had not been inside for the 4 days of testimony. They had been reading the papers. They had formed their view before the verdict was announced, and the verdict confirmed their expectation only in the sense that they had already concluded it was unjust. Within days of the acquittal, Greenwich saw riotous demonstrations. Pook's house was mobbed. Police reportedly had difficulty dispersing the crowd. Some reports explicitly connected the anger to a belief that Pook had escaped conviction because of his social standing and his family's connections. That connection between the verdict and class was the most politically charged element of the public reaction. It was not simply anger at a specific outcome. It was anger at a system that was understood to protect the sons of respectable tradesmen from consequences that would have fallen differently on the sons of dock labourers and night watchmen. The accessible record does not preserve a verbatim account of what the crowd in Greenwich said or did during those demonstrations. What it preserves is the characterization, riotous, difficult to disperse, connected to beliefs about class and legal protection. Those beliefs were not irrational, given the structure of the case: a servant girl, an employer's son, a pregnancy with no established paternity, a hearsay ruling that excluded the most explosive alleged evidence, a 20-minute jury retirement, 40 shillings in civil damages. The crowd drew its conclusions from that sequence. There was also a defense fund advertisement. The accessible record notes that in August of 1871, an advertisement appeared in the Times appealing for support for the Pook family on the grounds that the expense of the case threatened to ruin them. The family had employed solicitors and Queen's Counsel across the committal proceedings, the 4-day trial, and the subsequent libel actions. The cost was significant. The advertisement is a piece of the record that is easy to pass over, but is worth holding for a moment. The family of an acquitted man, within weeks of that acquittal, appealing publicly for financial assistance because the cost of proving his innocence, or of securing his acquittal, depending on which reading the reader held, had brought them close to ruin. Set against that advertisement is the monument. The memorial that was erected for Jane Maria Clouson stands in Brockley and Ladywell cemeteries, usually described in modern sources as standing in Brockley Cemetery. Its inscription, as transcribed on Wikimedia Commons and discussed by the Victorian Web, reads in part as follows: In the memory of Jane Maria Clouson, a motherless girl who was murdered in Kidbrooke Lane, Eltham, on the night of Tuesday 25th of April, 1871. She was taken to Guy's Hospital, where she died on Sunday, April 30th, 1871. Aged 17 years, her last words were, "Oh, let me die." This monument was erected by public subscription. The inscription calls it murder. Not alleged murder, not the suspected murder, not the killing for which Edmund Pook was tried and acquitted. Murder. The memorial does not name a perpetrator. It names a victim and it names an act. It was paid for by members of the public, not by a government authority, not by a court, not by a formal institution of record. By the community in which Jane Clouson had lived and worked, and in which she was still remembered as a motherless girl from Deptford who had gone out one Tuesday evening and had not come back. The memorial is a Tier 3 source. It is a constructed document, erected after the fact, shaped by the sympathies of those who paid for it and those who composed its inscription. Its description of Jane's death as murder is not the finding of any court that considered the evidence. It is the finding of the people who put the stone up. But it is in the record, it exists. It has existed since 1871, and its existence tells us something precise and important: that the community that surrounded this case did not accept the verdict of the jury as the final word on what had happened to Jane Clouson. The inscription also fixes her last words, "Oh, let me die," not the fuller sequence that Constable Gunn gave in his testimony, "Oh, my poor head, take hold of my hand, let me die," not the alleged naming of Pook that later cemetery history sources would add. The pamphlet's version, the leanest version, the version that contains nothing evidentially useful to the prosecution and nothing that could be challenged by the defense. The memorial chose that version. Whether that choice was deliberate, a decision to avoid placing an unverifiable identification on the stone, or simply reflected the version most widely known and most emotionally resonant at the time, the accessible record cannot determine. What the accessible record can say is that the version carved into the memorial is the version that sits closest to the pamphlet, which had explicitly said those were the only intelligible words extracted from her. The words on the stone are not a primary source for what Jane said. They are a primary source for how she was remembered. The case drew 2 false confessions. In March of 1873, a young soldier named Private George Ridout, Theodore Bingham, of the 52nd Regiment at Aldershot, confessed in writing that he had murdered Jane Clouson. He insisted in his written statement that Mr. Edmund Pook never was, meaning that Pook had not done it. Contemporary reporting immediately noted that from the circumstances of place and date, Bingham could not possibly have been guilty. He was dismissed from the inquiry. In 1888, 17 years after the murder, a man named Carroll made a self-accusation that was also dismissed after communication with Scotland Yard. Both confessions were false. Neither solved the case, neither provided any new evidence about what had happened in Kidbrooke Lane. But they are part of the record, and they belong here because of what their existence demonstrates. A false confession to a murder is not a trivial act. It is not an accident. People who confess falsely to crimes they did not commit do so for reasons that are not always recoverable, but the act itself requires a level of engagement with the case, a knowledge of the case, a fixation on the case, that does not exist for crimes that have been forgotten or resolved. In 1873, 2 years after the verdict, a soldier at Aldershot was sufficiently absorbed by the Pook case to write out a false confession and insist that the man acquitted had not done it. In 1888, 17 years after the verdict, another man did the same. The case had not closed in public consciousness. It had remained open, present, discussed, remembered. The false confessions are a measure of that persistence. They demonstrate that the Jane Clouson case was, for a significant portion of the population that had followed it, an unresolved matter of public record. The law had said, not guilty. The public had said, not proven at best. And 17 years later, men were still confessing to it. The legal debates the case generated were not resolved by the case itself. Crosland's pamphlet had proposed 2 reforms, a public prosecutor and a third verdict. Neither was enacted as a direct consequence of the Pook case. The Office of Director of Public Prosecutions was eventually established in England and Wales in 1879, 8 years after the Pook verdict, under the Prosecution of Offences Act. The accessible record does not establish a direct causal connection between the Pook case and that legislation, and the script will not assert one. What can be said is that the Pook case was a live instance of the argument that had been building in Victorian legal commentary for years, that leaving prosecution to police discretion and private initiative produced uneven results. The hearsay debate that Beauville's ruling generated was also not resolved by any immediate statutory change. The argument Crosland floated, the res gesti argument, the idea that what a victim says in the course of the act charged ought to be admitted as part of that act, has had a long subsequent history in English evidence law. That development took place over decades. The Pook case was one instance in a series of cases that gradually pushed at the boundaries of the hearsay rule. It did not alone change the law. It contributed to a conversation that eventually produced change. The not proven verdict was never introduced in England and Wales. It remains a feature of Scots law. The contemporaneous editorial argument that the Pook jury had really wanted something like not proven and had been forced into the binary of guilty or not guilty when the evidence fit neither cleanly, is an argument that has been made in various forms about various cases in England for 150 years since. There is one further element that belongs in this section. After the acquittal, after the demonstrations, after the libel proceedings, after the pamphlet and the counter-pamphlet and the press coverage, after all of that, the question that had driven everything was still unanswered. Who killed Jane Clouson? The admissible evidence had not convicted Edmund Pook. The circumstantial case against him had been substantial enough to generate an inquest verdict of wilful murder, a committal for trial, a 4-day hearing at the Old Bailey, and the sustained fury of a public that believed it knew the answer. But it had not been strong enough. Once the hearsay evidence was excluded, once the hammer chain's identification failure was exposed, once the blood could not be dated and the alibi could not be conclusively broken, to persuade 12 jurors beyond reasonable doubt. Contemporary commentary had settled into the position that the jury may have wanted not proven, not that the matter was proved either way. 2 false confessions had arrived and been dismissed. Libel proceedings had produced 40 shillings in damages and an undertaking to stop selling copies of the pamphlet. The monument in Brockley Cemetery said, "Murdered." The law said, "Not guilty." And between those 2 positions, nothing was resolved. There is a further strand of this reaction that the accessible record preserves in specific form, and which deserves attention before we close this section. The libel proceedings were not simply a legal mechanism. They were a public argument conducted in courtrooms about the relationship between a criminal verdict and the truth. The argument ran as follows. On one side, Edmund Pook had been tried, he had been acquitted, the law had determined the matter, and any publication that treated him as a murderer after that acquittal was a libel. The criminal verdict had legal finality. To continue publicly to argue for his guilt after acquittal was to usurp the function of the jury. On the other side, the law of libel and the law of evidence were separate questions. A publication might be technically libelous without being false. The truth defense in libel proceedings, the argument that a publication is not libelous because what it says is true, was available in principle, but the evidentiary difficulties of proving what a criminal trial had failed to prove were formidable. Crosland could not call the witnesses, repeat the trial, and prove the murder in a civil court. What he could argue was that commenting on a criminal trial and on a judge's legal rulings within that trial was within the bounds of legitimate public discourse. The grand jury's decision to ignore the bill against Farrar, the publisher, and the applause that produced in court suggests that there was public sympathy for the argument that publishing comment on a public criminal trial was not a crime. The civil verdict of 40 shillings, nominal damages, suggests that the special jury in Pook against Hartnell found the publication libelous in a technical sense, but did not regard it as having caused serious damage to a reputation that was itself unimpeachable. The boundary those proceedings tested between libel and fair comment on a public trial was not resolved cleanly in either direction. Crosland was not vindicated. He was also not silenced. He had written what he wrote, it had been read, and the legal proceedings against him had produced a nominal civil damages award and a lapsed commitment not to sell further copies of a pamphlet that had already been distributed. The argument continued in public after the proceedings ended. We close this section where the case itself settled. Not in a courtroom, not in a law report, in a cemetery in southeast London, on a monument paid for by public subscription. Jane Maria Clouson, a motherless girl, murdered in Kidbrooke Lane, died at Guy's Hospital on the 30th of April, 1871. Aged 17 years. Her last words, "Oh, let me die." The community that paid for that stone had watched the inquest, the police court hearings, the 4-day trial, the 20-minute jury retirement, the acquittal, and the riots in the streets of Greenwich. They had read the pamphlet. They had seen the libel proceedings. They had read the coverage in the Times and the Illustrated Police News and the regional papers that had reprinted the London proceedings for readers across the country. And at the end of all of that, they put up a stone that said murdered. Not alleged, not suspected, not the victim of an unsolved crime. Murdered. The stone does not say who murdered her. It does not name Edmund Walter Pook. It names an act and it names a victim. and it was erected by the people who had been closest to the case and who had drawn the conclusion that the law had declined to formalize. That conclusion has remained in the record since 1871. It has not been corrected. It has not been revisited by any subsequent legal process. It has not been challenged by any new evidence. The two false confessions were false. The law's verdict was not guilty. The monument says murdered. That gap between the stone and the verdict is what the Jane Clouson case leaves behind. This is the final section of the episode. In the 3 sections that preceded this one, we established what the record contains. We examined the discovery of Jane Clouson in Kidbrooke Lane on the 26th of April, 1871. We examined the evidence assembled across the inquest, the police court hearings, and the 4-day trial at the Central Criminal Court. We examined what happened after the verdict: the pamphlet, the libel proceedings, the demonstrations, the monument, the false confessions. In this section, we examine the gap. The gap is not a single thing. It is a series of specific contradictions and unresolved questions that the record preserves in documented form. It is the distance between the evidence that existed and the evidence that could be proved. It is the space between what the monument says and what the law decided. It is the accumulated residue of a case that was examined exhaustively and resolved unsatisfactorily. We will work through the contradictions in sequence. We will state what the record contains, where the record conflicts with itself, and where the record runs out entirely. We will not fill those spaces with inference presented as fact, and at the end we will state what this case was and what it became. The first and most fundamental contradiction in the record concerns Jane Clouson's final words. There are 3 versions of what she said between the moment Constable Gunn found her in Kidbrooke Lane and the moment she died at Guy's Hospital 4 days later. The first version comes from Gunn's own testimony before the magistrate. He gave a sequence: "Oh, my poor head. Oh, my poor head." Then, after he took her hand, "Let me die." Then silence. The second version comes from the pamphlet by Newton Crosland, which gave the shorter form, "Oh, let me die," and which added explicitly that those were the only intelligible words extracted from her, and that at the hospital nothing she uttered was distinctly audible. The third version appears in later cemetery history sources and states that she also said the name Edmund Pook. These 3 versions are not compatible with one another. They cannot all be correct. The pamphlet directly contradicts the later cemetery history account, stating that nothing audible was said beyond the one phrase. Gunn's testimony gives a fuller sequence than the pamphlet, but contains nothing that names a perpetrator. The alleged naming of Pook is the version that, if true, would have been most significant. It is also the version least supported by the earliest sources. The pamphlet was hostile to Pook and had every reason to include a dying identification if one existed and could be credibly claimed. It chose not to. It said instead that only, "Oh, let me die" was intelligible. The naming of Pook appears later. It is not in the primary testimony of the officer who found her. It is not in the pamphlet published weeks after the trial. It appears in a source considerably removed from the events. Lord Chief Justice Beauville ruled that any statement Jane had allegedly made before her death was inadmissible hearsay. That ruling removed the question of what she said from the jury's consideration entirely. But the ruling did not resolve the factual question of what she actually said. It only determined that the jury would not hear it. The record contains 3 versions of her final words. It does not reconcile them. The second contradiction concerns the relationship between Jane Clouson and Edmund Pook. The prosecution alleged a 2-year domestic intimacy, improper relations, a pregnancy, an arrangement to meet, a planned discussion of marriage. 2 female informants gave evidence that Jane had told them she was going to meet Pook on the night of the murder. The post-mortem established pregnancy. The prosecution's theory was that pregnancy was the motive and Pook was the father. Pook gave sworn evidence that he had never had any intimacy with Jane Clouson, had never made an appointment to meet her, had never walked out with her, and had never corresponded with her. The family's public position was that she had been dismissed for slovenly habits, not dismissed because of an affair. No Tier 1 source in the accessible record establishes the nature of the relationship as fact. The pregnancy is medically confirmed. Paternity is not established in the admissible record. The contradiction is absolute. The prosecution alleged a sustained intimate relationship. The defense denied every element of it on oath. Both positions were stated at the highest evidentiary level available, sworn testimony before a court. The jury heard both and acquitted. The record does not tell us which version was true. What the record does tell us is this. Jane Clouson left her lodgings on the evening of the 25th of April, 1871. She did not tell the people she was living with that she was going somewhere dangerous. She dressed and went out. She was found dying in a lane 4 miles from her lodgings in the early hours of the following morning. She had 11 shillings and 4pence in her purse. She had a locket and 2 keys and a pocket handkerchief. Nothing was taken from her. Whatever the reason she went to Kidbrooke Lane that night, and whoever she went there to meet, she went there from her lodgings in Greenwich of her own will. Why she went is not in the record. The third contradiction concerns the hammer. The weapon type was identified. The supply chain from Turner and Naylor of Sheffield to Thomas's ironmongery in Deptford was established. The sale on the 24th of April was documented. The hammer was found in the grounds of Magdalen College with blood and hair in the notch. Michael Harris gave his opinion that the wounds were consistent with that type of instrument. The purchaser was not conclusively identified. Sparshot said he directed a man he identified as Pook to Thomas's shop. Miss Cavell was in Thomas's shop when the sale was made and could not identify the buyer from any person shown to her at the police station. Those two pieces of testimony cannot both be fully accepted without resolution. Sparshot identified Pook. Cavell could not. The accessible record does not contain a clear identification by Mrs. Thomas. The Crawford evidence, which came forward after 10 weeks and which the pamphlet treats with skepticism, raised further questions about Sparshot's account without the verbatim substance of that challenge being recoverable from the accessible sources. The hammer chain was the prosecution's strongest physical strand after the clothing evidence. It was also the strand that contained the most visible break. The record establishes what the hammer was. It does not establish who bought it. The fourth contradiction concerns the blood and the hair. The chemical evidence found numerous spots of blood on the left leg of Pook's trousers, one on the right and a human hair on the left leg corresponding in colour with Jane's hair. Pook's explanation was that the blood came from his tongue, bitten in a fit, and from a fall in South Street. Victorian forensic science could not date the bloodstains. Dr. Letherby could identify blood. He could not determine when it had been deposited. The defense exploited that limitation with precision. The hair was a color match, not an individual identification. A human hair corresponding in color with another person's hair is a visual observation that places the two hairs in the same broad category. It does not establish contact between the wearer of the trousers and the person whose hair it matched. Both items of evidence were real. Both items of evidence were genuinely consistent with the prosecution's theory. Neither item of evidence conclusively proved what the prosecution needed it to prove. That distinction between evidence consistent with guilt and evidence proving guilt is the distinction the jury was required to apply. On the blood and hair, the evidence was consistent. It was not conclusive. Victorian forensic science did not have the tools to close the gap between those two positions. The record preserves both the evidence and its limitation. The fifth contradiction concerns the alibi and the seizure defense. Pook said he had been at Lewisham on the Tuesday evening, attempting to visit Miss Durnford. He had not seen her. He had returned through the park. He had run part of the way home because he felt a fit coming on. He had met no one who knew him except a person referred to only as our boy. The seizure claim was central to multiple elements of the defense case. It explained the blood on his hat, bitten tongue during a fit. It explained his physical state on returning home, the onset of a fit causing him to run. It explained the absence of independent witnesses to his movements. He had been managing his condition, not socializing. No medical witness was called to establish that Pook suffered from fits. That absence is not a minor procedural gap. It is the removal of the entire evidentiary foundation for a claim that ran through every aspect of the defense case concerning his physical state and his movements on the critical evening. The pamphlet identifies it and returns to it. The claim was made. the evidence for the claim was not provided. The alibi also had no independent corroboration for the most critical period, the Tuesday evening between roughly 9 o'clock and his return home. The person referred to as our boy was not a corroborating witness in any useful sense. Miss Durnford confirmed she had not seen Pook. Her confirmation of not seeing him established that his stated purpose in going to Lewisham had not been achieved. It did not confirm that he had been in Lewisham rather than elsewhere. The alibi for Tuesday evening was, "I was somewhere I cannot prove, attempting to see someone who did not see me, and I was alone except for a person I cannot identify. And the reason I was in the physical state I was in when I returned is a medical condition I will not provide medical evidence for." The jury acquitted. The sixth point in the gap is not a contradiction within the evidence. It is a structural feature of the case that the record preserves without resolving. The hearsay ruling removed the most explosive alleged evidence from the jury's consideration. The alleged dying identification of Pook, whether it was said in the lane to Gunn, or said at the hospital to someone who later repeated it, or never said at all, was excluded by Beauville's ruling before the jury could weigh it. Crosland's pamphlet argued that the ruling was wrong in its application to this specific case. His res geste argument, that what Jane said in going to meet the person who decoyed her from her home should have been admitted as part of the same continuous transaction, is recognizable as an argument that has had considerable subsequent development in English evidence law. But the argument was not accepted in 1871. The jury decided the case without hearing what Jane had allegedly said about where she was going and who she was going to meet. The structural consequence of that ruling is precise. The most direct evidence linking Pook to the crime, the alleged identification by the victim herself, was the evidence the jury was not permitted to hear. Every piece of evidence the jury did hear was circumstantial. The circumstantial evidence was not sufficient in the jury's assessment to prove guilt beyond reasonable doubt. Whether the outcome would have been different had the hearsay evidence been admitted is a question the record cannot answer. It is a question about a counterfactual. The jury that sat in July 1871 heard what Beauville allowed them to hear and decided what they decided. The record preserves the ruling. It does not tell us what the jury would have decided without it. The seventh point in the gap concerns the timing evidence. The prosecution's case depended heavily on time windows. It required that Pook could have been in Kidbrooke Lane on the Tuesday evening, returned to Greenwich, and been accounted for at home within a plausible time frame. It required that the witnesses who claimed to have seen a man matching his description near the lane had seen him at the right time. The accessible record notes that hostile contemporaries themselves complained that the times sworn to by witnesses did not harmonize neatly. That is a significant observation. If the prosecution's own supporters acknowledged that the timing evidence was imprecise, the defense had a straightforward avenue for challenge. A circumstantial case built on time windows fails if the time windows cannot be precisely established and internally reconciled. The accessible primary extracts do not reproduce the full timing testimony in recoverable detail. What the record preserves is the acknowledgement, from sources broadly sympathetic to the prosecution, that the timing evidence was imperfect. The prosecution needed the timing to work. Its supporters acknowledged it did not work cleanly. The eighth and final point in the gap concerns the broader evidentiary structure of the case. The prosecution had no direct evidence. It had no eyewitness to the attack. It had no surviving testimony from the victim about what had happened or who had done it. It had a victim who had died 4 days after being found dying in a lane, having said, at most, words that told no one what had happened to her. Everything the prosecution had was circumstantial. The hammer chain with its identification failure, the blood that could not be dated, the hair that could only be color-matched, the whistle that Miss Durnford identified and the defense challenged, the locket whose origin was disputed, the sighting evidence whose aggregate number the prosecution reported, but whose individual components are not fully recoverable, the behavioral evidence from Alice Wicks, the Fitz defense without a medical witness, the alibi without independent corroboration. Each of those strands was challenged. Each contained a point of weakness that the defense identified and pressed. No single strand was closed beyond challenge. The prosecution's case was the accumulated weight of all of them together, pointing in the same direction. The jury decided that accumulated weight was not sufficient. 20 minutes, the accessible record does not tell us what the jurors said to each other. It does not tell us which strand they found weakest, or whether they found all of them insufficient together, or whether the removal of the hearsay evidence had stripped the case of the anchor it needed to hold. It records the duration and the result. What the case leaves unresolved is not a single open question. It is a series of documented gaps that have remained unfilled since July 1871. The relationship between Jane Clouson and Edmund Pook. Allegation against denial, neither proved. The reason she went to Kidbrooke Lane on the night of the 25th of April, unknown. Who she went there to meet, unknown. What she said in the lane and at the hospital, 3 conflicting versions, none securely primary over the others for the full sequence. Who purchased the hammer at Thomas's ironmongery on the 24th of April, not conclusively established. Whether the blood on Pook's clothing came from the attack or from the causes he described, not determinable with Victorian forensic science. Whether Pook was in Kidbrooke Lane or in Lewisham on the Tuesday evening, not established by independent corroboration for either location. Whether the Fitz claim was medically genuine, no medical evidence provided. Whether the verdict would have been different had the hearsay evidence been admitted. Unknowable. Who killed Jane Clouson? Not determined by any legal process that concluded with a finding. Those are the gaps. They are not speculative. They are the documented absences in a record that was examined as thoroughly as Victorian legal procedure permitted. There are 2 false confessions in the record, and they deserve a final word before we close the evidentiary account. Private George Rideau, Theodore Bingham of the 52nd Regiment at Aldershot, confessed in writing in March 1873 that he had murdered Jane Clouson. He insisted that Mr. Edmund Pook never was. Contemporary reporting established immediately that he could not have been guilty from circumstances of place and date. A man named Carroll made a similar self-accusation in 1888. It was dismissed after communication with Scotland Yard. Both were false. Neither illuminated the case. What they illuminate instead is the duration of the case's hold on public consciousness. 2 years after the verdict, a false confession. 17 years after the verdict, another. The case had not been forgotten. It had not been superseded by new information or resolved by new evidence. It had simply remained open, present in memory, unfinished. The people who confessed falsely to it were engaging with something that was still alive in public record and public mind. This is what the Jane Clouson case was. A 17-year-old domestic servant from Deptford was found dying in a lane in Eltham in the early hours of the 26th of April, 1871. She died 4 days later at Guy's Hospital without making any statement that could be used in the proceedings that followed. She was approximately 2 months pregnant. She had been in domestic service with a stationer's family in Greenwich for nearly 2 years and had left that household a fortnight before she was attacked. Nothing was taken from her in the lane. The wounds to her head were consistent with a sharp and heavy instrument. A hammer of the relevant type was found near the scene with blood and hair in the notch. A young man named Edmund Walter Pook, the son of the stationer in whose household Jane had worked, was identified as a suspect through the testimony of 2 women who said Jane had told them she was going to meet him on the night of the murder. He was charged with wilful murder. He was tried at the Central Criminal Court before the Lord Chief Justice over 4 days in July 1871. The judge ruled that all statements Jane had allegedly made before her death were inadmissible hearsay. The jury deliberated for 20 minutes. They acquitted him. The public reaction was immediate and hostile. A pamphlet attacking the verdict and the hearsay ruling appeared within weeks. Libel proceedings were brought. Civil damages of 40 shillings were awarded. A monument was erected by public subscription in Brockley Cemetery that called Jane's death a murder. 2 false confessions arrived in 1873 and 1888 and were both dismissed. No one was ever convicted of the murder of Jane Maria Clouson. That is what the case was. This is what it became. In the immediate aftermath of the trial, it became a class story. The stationer's son and the servant girl. The respectable family in London Street and the dock labourer's daughter from Deptford. A verdict delivered in 20 minutes that the street outside the court received with fury. A pamphlet. Riots in Greenwich. A monument that said murdered when the law had said not guilty. In the decades that followed, it became an instance in a legal argument. The hearsay rule, the res gestae exception, the question of whether a victim's words, spoken in the immediate aftermath of violence, ought to reach the jury that decides what happened to her. That argument was not resolved by the Pook case, it was contributed to by it. English evidence law developed over the following century in ways that have partially addressed the problem Beauville's ruling exposed. The specific ruling of July 1871 cannot be undone. Its consequence, a jury deciding a murder case without hearing the alleged dying identification of the victim, is recorded and remains. In the longer historical record, the case became a Victorian true crime narrative. It acquired the properties of that genre: a respectable family, a servant girl, a pregnancy, a weapon, a controversial acquittal, a crowd in the street. It was retold in the press and in popular histories and in the kind of local history accounts that attached it to the geography of southeast London. In those retellings, details shifted. The alleged dying words became settled and specific, where the primary record had left them contested. The number of witnesses became a fixed figure, where the primary record had given an aggregate. The character of Pook became more lurid, and the character of Jane became more sentimental. The gap between the primary record and the later retelling is documented at every stage. One line: this was the recorded death of a girl the law could not protect, and a case the law could not close. It became a story about justice denied, a servant betrayed, and a verdict that a community refused to accept. The story is in the record. The record is what we have. The sources for this episode are as follows. The primary sources are the police court testimony as reported in the contemporary press, the trial record at the Central Criminal Court in July 1871, and the medical evidence given by Michael Harris, surgeon of Guy's Hospital. The trial falls within the coverage of the Old Bailey proceedings. The specific case is the trial of Edmund Walter Pook, July 1871. Researchers seeking the primary record should begin there. The pamphlet by Newton Crosland, The Eltham Tragedy Reviewed, published by F. Farrer in the summer of 1871, is a Tier 2 source in the methodology of this archive. It is a contemporary document written by a named author with a declared position. It is not a neutral record. It is an important record. Those are not the same thing. The monument in Brockley Cemetery is a matter of public record. Its inscription is transcribed on Wikimedia Commons and has been discussed by the Victorian web. It exists. It says what it says. The Times coverage of the case ran from the 2nd of May through the 21st of July, 1871, and beyond into the libel proceedings. The Illustrated London News covered the trial. The Illustrated Police News carried a portrait of the accused in May 1871. Regional papers reprinted London proceedings across the country. The two false confessions, Bingham in 1873, Carroll in 1888, are in the contemporary press record. No verbatim coroner's transcript naming the coroner and giving the exact inquest sitting dates has been recovered in the accessible sources on which this episode is based. The accessible record confirms the inquest took place and confirms its verdict: wilful murder against Edmund Walter Pook. The exact wording beyond those two words and the coroner's name remain unverified in the accessible material. That gap is stated here as a limitation of the episode, not as a settled fact about the historical record. A researcher with direct access to the London Metropolitan Archives or to the digitized coroner's records held at the London Borough of Lewisham may recover what this episode cannot confirm. The full verbatim record of Pook against Crosland in the civil proceedings has not been recovered in the accessible sources. The figure of £50 in damages attributed to that case in a later cemetery history article has not been verified against a contemporary law report. It is not stated as fact in this episode. Those limitations are part of the record of this episode. The Black Archive does not present unverified claims as established facts. Where the record runs out, we say so. The methodology of this archive is as follows. Every case examined here is approached through a 4-stage process. The event, what physically happened, as documented in the primary record. The record, what the courts heard, what the evidence contained, what was proved and what was not. The reaction, how the case was received, reported, retold and remembered. The gap, what the record leaves unresolved, where the sources contradict one another, and what the distance between those contradictions reveals about the case and about the system that handled it. The purpose of that methodology is not to solve old cases. It is not to accuse acquitted men or to relitigate verdicts. It is to document with precision the distance between what happened and what the law was able to determine, and to examine how that distance was subsequently filled by press, by pamphlet, by monument, by public memory, and by the genre of true crime narrative that grew from cases exactly like this one. The Jane Clouson case is one of the clearest instances in the Victorian record of all four stages operating simultaneously and in visible conflict with one another. The event was documented from the first hour. The record was examined at every available legal level. The reaction was immediate, sustained, and legally contested. And the gap has remained open for 150 years. It remains open now. Further material on the Jane Clouson case, including the written case file, the source notes, and the paid-tier archive analysis, is available at the Black Archive on Substack. The link is in the profile. Thank you for listening to the Black Archive.